Hey peeps, welcome back. I just wanted to do a video showing you a couple new Max for Live devices that I'll be releasing soon, and also go through a couple of presets and a sample pack that I'll be adding to my preset pack on Gumroad. But before we do that, I'll just use this little breakbeat to show you what these two new Max for Live devices actually do. So here I have a little breakbeat, and the first device that I'm going to focus on is GMaudio Noizyer. So this device is basically an envelope follower, and it uses that envelope to add either noise in mono or stereo, random clicks, static, or a 50 Hz hum to the signal. And this was originally created to add a stereo noise to a drum signal to allow those drums to punch through the mix. So something like a kick that is generally mono, by adding a little bit of stereo noise that follows the envelope of that kick, you can get a kind of pseudo stereo effect, and it also allows that kick to punch through the mix that little bit better, allowing you to get the feeling of louder drums with less peak volume. So let's go through some of the controls. The main control is this amount, and this set at 0, it will just play the signal that will be output by the device. So you can hear that it's very quiet right now because the default is a very low level signal. So I'll just turn this stuff up. So that's what it's going to be adding to the signal when you turn up the amount. So at 100%, it's going to follow the envelope of the incoming signal, and at minus 100%, it's actually going to sidechain to that signal. So there's a bunch of other controls in this device to further shape the sound that it adds to the incoming signal. And the first lot of controls is the envelope controls. So this controls the envelope that's generated from the incoming signal. So you have attack. You've got gain, which is basically how high the envelope will reach, adding more of the signal from Noisier to the incoming signal. And then release, the time it takes for the volume of these auxiliary signals coming from Noisier to fall back down to 0. So the defaults are kind of set for just adding that little bit of noise to a drum hit. The second lot of controls is the tone controls, and these do a variety of things. So the first one is the click rate, and this is basically how frequent there will be a click. So if I just return this to 0%, and I'll just turn down the noise and turn up the clicks, so you can hear that the clicks are in stereo as well. And if I go to tones and turn up the click rate, you can hear that the clicks become more frequent, or you can have them very sparse. So that's the only control that there is for clicks, basically the volume in the mixer section and the rate in the tone section. So now if we focus on the noise, in this tones tab, there's amplitude modulation. And this can be used to add some kind of randomness to the volume of the noise, but also as a bit of distortion as you go into higher frequencies of this amplitude modulation. So it can become a lot more gritty, or do more of a kind of sweeping type effect. There's also filters for the noise, so you can shape it to exactly where you want this noise to sit in the mix. And the default low passes the noise at around 4 kilohertz. So that way there's a little bit in the presence range, but not too much. And if you open that up, you can hear it's a lot brighter. Then there's a high pass filter, where if you drop that, it'll have a lot more low end. So by default, it's high passed. And then there's the simple tilt EQ. So this is basically a high shelf at around 700 hertz that you can use to darken the noise or brighten the noise. There's also an EQ section. So this is just a single parametric EQ that you can use to remove either mids or some in the presence range, some part of the auxiliary signal that Noisier is adding. So you could use this to really focus the sound on a particular frequency if you wanted to. Or just use it to make a cut somewhere so the noise isn't so prominent in your mix. And then lastly, the mixer section is just volume controls for all the different signals that Noisier can add. So far we've just been listening to noise and the clicks. And there is a switch to switch between stereo noise and mono noise. The default is stereo noise. And then there's also a volume control for static. So if I turn this up, sounds a bit like Aliens. And this also will follow the envelope. So that could be used as some sort of effect. It was just an interesting sound that I had from a previous project, so I thought that I'd include it in this device. Then there's also hum, which is basically noise with the resonant filter at 50 hertz, and that just adds this kind of analog noise type sound. So all of them will follow the envelope of the incoming signal. And if I play this breakbeat and just turn it on and off, you can hear the difference. So it can be quite a subtle effect, and that is what originally it was created for. But I've left it so you can go for extreme settings and do more kind of sound design. And if you follow this with compressors, multi-band compressors, limiters and stuff like that, then you can get some real dirt into your drums, which is great for lo-fi type genres or just really edgy kind of industrial noisy type music. So with this at minus 100% on sidechain, we can definitely get a bit of that lo-fi vibe. And if you follow that with something like Devolve Dramatics and really smash it, then you can get a lot of pumping effects. You could even just use it as a noise generator to kind of build some sweeps. So say I have this at 100% and I can reset some of these. And use something like a filter to build some kind of sweep effects. So this will also follow the envelope, so you could do this both at the same time, create a kind of sweep and use it to create a sound effect. So that's just a couple examples of how you might use it. And now I'll focus on the next device, which is GMaudio TransD. So this is a transient designer, which basically looks at the difference between the peak level and the average level of the incoming signal and generates an envelope which can be used to control either the attack or transient portion of the sound or the sustain or decay portion of the sound. So you could use this to just add some extra smack to drum parts, and that's initially what it was created for. But you could also use it as a noise gate if you turn the sustain all the way down. So this breakbeat that I have has a bit of noise in there. But I'll add Noisier to add some noise into the signal just to make it a bit more prominent. And then you'll hear the effect that TransD has by gating this noise. So there it's kind of being used to tidy up a recording, which is pretty useful. So you could use that for maybe a field recording where you've picked up a lot of noise and you can turn the sustain right down to basically gate the sound. But if I just set this back to default and just turn up the attack, we just get a little bit more punch to our drums. And if I turn down the sustain again, it's gating that sound. Now, to get the most out of this particular device, this focus control is very important. So there's a filter at the start of the signal flow in this device, and that allows you to select an area to focus on, which just gives you a bit more control over what GMaudio TransD is doing, and allows you to add a bit more smack to certain parts of the drum sound. So if I reset this to default, and say I want to focus more on the snare, then I could go somewhere around 3 kilohertz, where the kind of top end of the snare sits, and then boost the attack. And you can hear that it's pretty much just increasing the transient information for just the snare. And if I turn this down to something like 100 hertz, then it'll focus on mostly the kick. Now you can hear a bit of distortion in there, and that's because this soft clip is on. So with it off, you can see that the signal goes way beyond 0, and that can kind of cause issues further down the line. So this soft clip algorithm basically starts to round off the signal as it gets closer to -3 dB and completely clips the signal before it reaches 0 dB. That way you can accommodate these really high attack settings without getting any clipping. It also adds a little bit of distortion to the transient period, and that can also help the drums kind of cut through the mix a little bit better as well. So the default is 1.25 kilohertz, which works best for kind of broad range signals. So perhaps something like synthesizers or claps, stuff like that. And just adding, say, 6 dB of attack and -6 dB sustain, you're basically reshaping the volume of the incoming signal over time, much like you would with a compressor, but there's no threshold to adjust, and you just add the amount of smack that you want to your drums. So it just tightens it up that little bit more and adds a little bit more transient information. So this is also quite a subtle effect, but the two actually work quite well together. So I'll just reset these settings to the default. So it's just double click to reset a parameter to its default, in case you didn't know. And I'm just gonna go be a little bit more heavy-handed with the Transient Designer. So because this Noisier device is adding noise between 1 kilohertz and 4 kilohertz, and I'm using this EQ to take out around 2 kilohertz, so generally it's more focused around 1.5K. And it's adding that noise following the envelope of the signal. And if I follow that with TransD, then there's even more signal for TransD to listen to push the signal further. So having this Noisier just before TransD can actually get a little bit more punch out of the drums. So this one is adding this kind of pseudo stereo effect with this stereo noise that is following the envelope of the sound. And then this is reshaping the envelope of the sound, adding more punch and reducing the decay or sustain portion of the sound. And if I turn them both off, and back on. So a lot tighter drums. And as I mentioned, they're quite subtle effects, but there is room for you to push them into more sound design territory for more creative effects. So that's the two devices. You can get those from my Gumroad at gumroad.com/RobertKGM. And now for the rest of this video, I'll kind of just go through this project that I whipped up this morning. So I am using a new sample pack that I'll be adding to my Gumroad as well. And I'll do a video on how I created this sample pack. So please subscribe to my YouTube channel and keep an eye out for that one. But basically I used CliffX to randomize Ableton's collision instrument and recorded 256 variations of collision and then split that into samples and renamed them and came up with this pack. I'll just whiz through some of the sounds here. You can see there's 256 sounds, and they range from kind of kick drum sounds to weird percussion to hats to kind of zaps and everything in between. So they're all in stereo as well. So that can be really good for adding a bit more stereo interest to drum parts. So you can hear that it's pretty random, and that can be really good for some kind of glitch type styles. But there's also some cool sounds in there that you could use for techno or make some kind of weird hat rhythms for something like drum and bass or trap or pop music or whatever. So lots of interesting sounds, all in stereo, and definitely focused on drum type sounds, but you could do other things with it as well and use them as more melodic type sounds because they do have quite a bit of tonal aspect to them, and they make a pretty useful addition to the other drum sounds that are in my preset pack. So another preset that I'll add to my preset pack on Gumroad is this collision synth. So if I just solo this, this is using collision to create a snare. So this can be pitched to any pitch. You've got control over decay, a little bit of control over the tone, the pitch envelope, and drive. And all the audio effects that follow it just help shape that into a more convincing snare type sound. Now, the kick synth is already in the preset pack, and that I've been using in all of my tracks that I create under my Ghost alias, as well as this collision snare So if you're interested in getting those, jump over to my Gumroad, gumroad.com/RobertKGM, and that preset pack will go up in price as I add more things to the pack. So it'll jump up from $5 to $10. That's Australian, so still super cheap. And if you've gotten any other of my devices, then keep an eye out in your emails and you might get a discount link on that preset pack. So let's have a look at some of these other sounds that are in this project. These two instruments here are basically a drum rack with every single sound that's in that collision drum sample pack. And I'm just using some random MIDI and my note probability device to trigger random samples. And I quite like the effect that it gives. Kind of just got this random funk, which I like. All these drum parts do have a bit of swing on them, which adds to the funk. And there are quite a few effects happening in this project as well. So you can see I've got Noisier on this snare instrument, which is just helping the top end of the snare cut through a little bit. It's quite subtle, but then boosting it with the EQ and then also using the Transient Designer. It's just helping that snare cut through that little bit more. I'm also using the Transient Designer on the kick. If I turn that off. So you can hear that it's got a lot more punch with the settings that I have. So I've got it focused at 500 Hertz. So I want the transient detail in the mid frequencies on this kick, but I don't want them to linger. So I've turned the sustain right down and the attack up. And that's just giving the kick lots of punch, but then still keeping the kick quite short and allowing plenty of room for synthesizers or bass lines. So with it off, with it on. Nice and short and punchy. I am using a bit of Noisier on both these random drum instruments as well. And then just helping gluing the sound together and also adding a bit of punch to those sounds. So another kind of byproduct of layering this noise with the drum parts in your mix is that it's very similar to adding something like a glue compressor. Basically, a glue compressor will compress all the sounds together and add a slight bit of saturation to that sound and help shape the transients of the sound to help glue all those drum parts together. And Noisier is doing a kind of similar thing in that it's layering this stereo noise with your drum parts, but by placing that on your drum bus and using it quite subtly, you're helping glue all those sounds together because they have this common element of noise. So it's quite a subtle effect in that instance, but it really can help glue drum sounds together. Now I've actually got some key mapping set up so I can turn off all of the Noisier Max for Live devices and the TransD Max for Live devices. So this is with neither of those devices. It still has my Devolve Dramatics device on there, which if I turn that off, it makes the drums very weak. So that's doing a lot to beef up all my drum parts. But if I turn on Noisier, and I'll just turn it off, and back on. So So not sure if you can hear that. You'll probably need some headphones, but it is definitely gluing those sounds together and bringing all of the sounds forward without adding any real peak volume extra to those sounds. So really great subtle effect. So now I'll turn on the Transient Designer Max for Live device so you can hear the difference between that. And off. And then back on. So in this instance, it's just tightening things up a bit, which is making a bit more room for the bass line. So I'll show you what's going on with this bass, and I'll just solo it. Now I've got quite a bit of processing, and how I'm processing this bass might give you some inspiration and different tricks that you can use to create something new or do something different with your basses. But basically I'm using a LFO to turn on different chains, MIDI chains which have different pitch effects, and I'm actually using my MIDI send device for my FMFX device in one of those MIDI effect chains, and that's always sending a different pitch to the FMFX device than what is being sent to my actual synth instrument. And that's just to give it a little bit different flavor. So something to try out. And yeah, just using an LFO to change which MIDI effect is being sent to my synth instrument. Kind of randomly changing the pitches, which I quite like. And then that kind of interplay reacts differently with the FMFX at these different pitches. And I've also got a bit of automation happening on the amount and the folds of my wave folder device, just to give some kind of rhythm to the bass. So there is a bit of erosion on this bass line, and where erosion and Noisier kind of differentiate is erosion is actually adding distortion to the signal by modulating part of the signal with noise. So on wide noise, the signal is going in and is basically like a bandpass filter, and that filtered signal is then being amplitude modulated by stereo noise in the wide noise setting, which is adding this distortion, which is playing in parallel to the original sound. So erosion is actually adding extra harmonics and distortion to the sound, whereas Noisier is simply just following the envelope of the incoming sound and adding noise to it. So two quite different devices. Erosion is really good on bass lines to add some extra information to the top end of stuff, especially before distortions. So I'm also using my Val Max for Live effect, and I'm using a random LFO to kind of jump between different Val sounds, and then also using an auto pan to gate that on 16th notes. And then I've got another chain in this effect rack, which is just a sweeping notch filter. And that's just to add some movement to this bass sound. So it's quite subtle, but it just adds a little bit more interest to the sound. Also using a low pass filter with a random signal modulating the rate of a ramp down LFO on the filter to give some kind of different rhythms to the top end of this bass. So with it off. With it on. as you can see, there's lots of random happening in this particular project, and this was just me going a little bit bananas like I like to do. And I kind of enjoy hearing what the computer comes up with by using this randomness. And with a project like this, I would probably resample a lot of stuff and then edit the audio to really put some intent behind the sounds rather than have all this randomness going on. But there's definitely some interesting sounds that it spits out with all this randomization, which I really like. Now, this device here is one that I'm working on and will be released soon. It's called GMaudio Universe, and the idea behind this is to kind of solve some of those issues for adding lots of stereo width to a sound. So this is actually using the new multi-channel features in Max, and it's duplicating the signal however many times you like, either 2 times, 4 times, 8 times, or 12 times, and performing a bunch of modulation to kind of psychoacoustic aspects of the sound. Psychoacoustics, or how we perceive where sound is coming from, is based on 3 things: interaural time difference, so the time difference between 2 ears; interaural amplitude difference, which is the volume between 2 different ears; and also the kind of head-related transfer function of our ears, and the phase differences in the signal when things are higher or lower than our head height. So it's doing all this modulation based on kind of the fundamentals of binaural audio. So I'm calling it GMaudio Universe, the binaural modulator. It basically just makes any mono signal super stereo without introducing nasty phase issues. So if I turn this off and back on, so I just wanted to kind of mention that. Keep an eye out for that, and also subscribe to my YouTube channel to hear more about that device, and also a heap of other Ableton tips and tricks. I'll be doing a video soon on audio effect racks, which are super duper powerful. So also keep an eye out for that. But for now, I'll just leave you with this little loop, and I'll see you next time.